The Underdog Strategy. Every favorite in history has carried the same invisible burden alongside its advantages, the burden of being watched closely, planned against, and defended against by an opponent who has already decided the favorite is worth the trouble of a serious defense. The underdog carries no such burden. She is planned against carelessly, if she is planned against at all, and that carelessness is not a small thing. It is, correctly used, one of the most reliable tactical advantages available in any contest. The masses experience being the underdog as pure disadvantage, less funding, less credibility, less access, a smaller share of whatever resource the favorite already commands. What the historical record actually shows across war rooms, courtrooms, laboratories, and frontier towns is that every one of those shortages comes bundled with a single, considerable asset: an opponent who has stopped watching you closely enough to see what you're actually building. This is not a philosophy of consolation, offered to make disadvantage feel less painful. It is a study in structural advantage, the specific, repeatable mechanisms by which people throughout history took a position everyone had already dismissed and used the very dismissal as the raw material for victories the favorites never saw coming. 10 laws follow. Everything in this record depends on a single reversal. Disadvantage is not simply a shortage. It is a shortage bundled with a specific, usable asset: an opponent who has stopped watching closely enough to prepare for what you're actually capable of. Begin with the law every other law in this record depends on. The first law: let their confidence be your only weapon. Tomyris, ruling the Massagetae people on the edges of the Persian Empire, faced an invasion led by Cyrus the Great, one of the most successful military commanders of the ancient world, at the head of an empire vastly larger and better resourced than her own confederation of steppe tribes. Cyrus, by surviving accounts, treated the campaign as a formality, employing a deceptive maneuver involving abandoned wine and provisions to lure a portion of her forces into a trap. Tomyris responded not by matching his resources, which she did not have, but by exploiting exactly the overconfidence that had led him to underestimate the resolve of an army he assumed would collapse quickly. Her forces ultimately defeated his, and Cyrus himself died in the campaign, one of the most powerful rulers of antiquity, undone by an opponent his own confidence had never taken seriously enough to prepare for properly. Artemisia I of Caria commanded ships in the Persian fleet at the Battle of Salamis against a Greek force she and her allies had been expected, by their own side's confidence, to overwhelm easily. The battle went badly for the Persian fleet overall, but Artemisia's own conduct during it, resourceful enough that Xerxes, watching from shore, is reported to have remarked that his men had become women and his women had become men, demonstrated a tactical sharpness that outlasted the confidence of commanders who had assumed size alone would decide the day. This is the first law. An opponent's confidence, unearned by actual preparation, is the single greatest resource available to whoever that confidence is aimed at. The masses, facing a stronger opponent, focus entirely on their own shortage of resources. The strategist focuses instead on her opponent's surplus of unearned confidence, because confidence unaccompanied by preparation is simply a blind spot with a flattering name. Translate this into an ordinary competitive situation. A rival, confident of an easy win, prepares less thoroughly than the situation actually requires, assuming the outcome is already settled. The underdog who notices this and prepares as though the contest were genuinely contested, because for her it is, routinely outperforms opponents who mistook the appearance of an easy contest for the reality of one. There is a documented pattern in competitive psychology worth naming directly. Heavily favored competitors, across a range of studied contests, consistently underprepare relative to underdogs, a phenomenon researchers attribute partly to the discomfort of over-preparing for an opponent. One has already decided is not a serious threat. Over-preparation, in that circumstance, feels almost like an admission that the favorite's status might be undeserved. The underdog carries no such discomfort, and typically prepares to the full extent the contest actually requires. Jerry Cobb underwent the same rigorous physiological testing given to the Mercury astronaut candidates as part of a privately organized program, later known as the Mercury 13, and passed with results that were, on several measures, superior to those of the men selected for the official program, a program NASA never took seriously enough to build a formal evaluation process around, dismissing the results and the candidates alike without ever mounting the kind of institutional defense a genuinely threatening challenge would have required. Elizabeth I spent part of her youth declared illegitimate by her own father's decree and was, at one point, imprisoned in the Tower of London by her half-sister's regime on suspicion of conspiracy, a position from which her eventual claim to the throne looked, to most observers at court, considerably less likely than the claims of several rivals positioned more securely around her. Those rivals, and the factions supporting them, spent their preparation on each other, treating the imprisoned, disinherited princess as a diminished threat rather than the eventual monarch who would outlast every one of them. An opponent's overconfidence is a passive gift. Being perceived as harmless is a more active version of the same asset, one that grants entry to rooms a more visibly ambitious presence would never be allowed into at all. The second law. Let being harmless buy you the room. Phryne, a courtesan in ancient Athens celebrated for her beauty, was put on trial for her life on charges of impiety, a trial her advocate is said to have won, according to later accounts, by a defense built partly on the assumption that judges would not condemn someone the culture around them had already decided was more ornament than threat. Whatever the precise mechanics of her acquittal, the underlying dynamic is instructive. An opponent's own low estimation of what she was capable of arguing or defending became in the moment that mattered most the very thing that saved her. Policarpa Salavarrieta worked as a seamstress in colonial New Granada during the independence movement against Spanish rule, a profession that gave her routine, unsuspicious access to the homes of Spanish officials and their families, where she gathered intelligence and passed messages for the revolutionary cause for years before her eventual capture. Her occupation was never treated by colonial authorities as a plausible cover for espionage, precisely because a seamstress was considered too far beneath political relevance to require monitoring. The masses assume that being taken seriously is always the goal, correcting every impression that undersells their actual capability. The second law suggests the opposite calculation in specific circumstances. Being considered harmless grants access and leniency. No visibly serious threat is ever offered, and a strategist who understands which rooms reward that harmlessness can use it precisely where a more serious reputation would have closed the door before she ever got through it. Consider the ordinary version: a negotiation, a meeting, an audit, where being visibly unthreatening grants a degree of latitude and access that a more openly assertive presence would immediately restrict. The strategist does not confuse this latitude with actual powerlessness. She simply recognizes which specific rooms reward the appearance of harmlessness, and reserves her visible ambition for rooms where it is actually rewarded instead. Sophie Blanchard built a career as a professional aeronaut in early 19th century France, valued initially by Napoleon's court largely as a novelty entertainer, providing spectacle rather than as a serious aviation pioneer. A low estimation that nonetheless granted her direct access to the highest levels of French society, and, eventually, an official appointment as aeronaut of the official festivals, a position her entertainer's reputation opened far more easily than a more overtly ambitious posture would have. Harmlessness grants access. What you do once inside the room is a separate question. And sometimes what you do is simply claim a role no one in that room had budgeted for you to want. The third law: step into the role no one expected you to claim. Deborah, described in the biblical record as a judge leading the Israelites, at a time when the role of military and political leadership was assumed by custom to belong to men, organized and directed a successful military campaign against a technologically superior Canaanite force. Commanding the confidence of the general she worked alongside specifically because her judgment had already proven reliable in matters the culture around her had not expected a woman to be consulted on at all. Kate Sheppard led the campaign that made New Zealand the first self-governing country to grant women the right to vote, organizing petitions that gathered tens of thousands of signatures through methodical, unglamorous grassroots work that the political establishment of her era did not initially treat as a serious threat to the existing order, precisely because the campaign's leadership did not fit the establishment's expectation of where political pressure was supposed to originate. The masses wait for permission, explicit or implied, before stepping into a role the culture around them has not yet offered. The third law asks a colder question. Has the role, examined honestly, ever actually been closed by anything other than an assumption no one has bothered to test? Deborah and Sheppard both stepped into leadership roles their surrounding culture had not designed for them, and in both cases, the surprise of the role being claimed at all became part of what made it effective. An opponent unprepared for this particular claimant is an opponent unprepared, period. The modern equivalent of this law shows up whenever someone steps into a leadership vacuum that culture or convention had assumed would be filled by someone else entirely. The quietest person in a meeting who ends up running the project. The newest hire who ends up training everyone senior to her. An opponent, or a rival, or simply an entrenched expectation, prepared for the role to be claimed by someone else, is an opponent who is not prepared for you at all. Delia Derbyshire worked as a studio assistant at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop at a time when electronic composition was not considered a serious creative role for the technicians occupying it, and produced groundbreaking electronic arrangements, including the original realization of a theme that would become one of British television's most recognizable pieces of music. That the institution around her had never designed a formal creative credit structure to fully acknowledge, having simply not anticipated that kind of composition emerging from that particular role at all. Wu Zetian entered the imperial court at one of the lowest formal ranks available to a concubine, a position carrying essentially no independent political standing, and rose across decades of court maneuvering to eventually rule in her own name as emperor, the only woman in Chinese history to hold that title outright, rather than as regent or empress consort. No formal path from her original rank to that position existed for anyone to prepare a defense against, because no one at court had ever needed to imagine that particular ascent before. Some roles can be claimed simply by stepping forward. Others are guarded by an entire system that will not open the door, regardless of how qualified the person knocking on it happens to be. The fourth law. When the system won't let you in, leave the system. Bessie Coleman was refused admission to every American flight school she approached on account of both her race and her gender, and rather than continuing to petition a system that had already made its position clear, she learned French, traveled to France, and earned her pilot's license there instead, becoming the first black woman and first Native American woman to hold an international pilot's license, returning to the United States as a licensed aviator. The domestic schools that had refused her now had to reckon with as an established fact rather than a hypothetical applicant. Gertrude Bell, denied the kind of formal diplomatic career available to men of her class and education, built an independent reputation as an archaeologist, writer, and political advisor through extensive travel and work across the Middle East, eventually becoming one of the most influential Western figures in the region's post-war political arrangements. Influence built almost entirely outside the formal diplomatic corps that would never have granted her a comparable position through its ordinary channels. The masses refused entry to a system, spend enormous energy petitioning that same system for reconsideration. The fourth law offers a more efficient alternative. When a specific door is closed and shows no sign of opening, the strategist builds her credentials somewhere. The door is already open and returns, if she returns at all. As a fact, the original system now has to accommodate, rather than a request it can simply continue denying. There is a considerable psychological difference, worth naming plainly, between petitioning a closed door and arriving already credentialed through a different one. The first invites the same gatekeepers to exercise the same judgment that closed the door originally. The second presents those gatekeepers with a fact already established elsewhere, which requires an entirely different kind of response than a request does. Refusing a request costs a gatekeeper nothing. Refusing to acknowledge an already earned credential costs them their own credibility. Building credentials elsewhere is one answer to a closed system. Another is simply walking directly into the exact arena that system assumed was safe from serious competition and competing on its own unmodified terms. The fifth law: compete where they didn't expect competition at all. Toni Stone became the first woman to play professional baseball in a men's league, joining the Negro Leagues at a level of competition that assumed, by default, no serious female competitor would ever appear in it, and played second base across a career that required her to be measured against the same pitching and fielding standards as every male player on the field, with no separate, softer category available to retreat into. Annie Oakley competed and won in shooting exhibitions against some of the most skilled marksmen of her era, entering competitions that had never been designed with a serious female competitor in mind, and built a career on the sheer, undeniable fact of her accuracy in a discipline where the competition's own confidence rarely accounted for the possibility that the most dangerous shooter in the room might be a woman. The masses, considering an arena traditionally closed to people like them, tend to look for a modified, softer version of the competition to enter instead, a separate category, a lower bar, a more forgiving standard. The fifth law suggests entering the exact same arena on the exact same terms, specifically because an arena's low expectations of who might show up produce an opponent whose guard is lowest precisely where the underdog's actual skill is highest. This requires a specific kind of nerve the masses rarely summon, choosing the harder, unmodified version of a contest specifically because it is harder, rather than seeking the more forgiving adjacent category everyone expects her to prefer. The modified category is, by design, less contested and therefore less valuable to win. The unmodified arena is exactly where an underdog's victory carries weight a softer category could never produce. Rosa Bonheur obtained official police permission to wear trousers, citing the practical need to move through slaughterhouses, stockyards, and other spaces closed to women in conventional dress, in order to study animal anatomy directly rather than working from second-hand sketches. Access that placed her in direct competition with male animal painters working from exactly the same unfiltered reference, in an arena where the realism her direct access produced simply outmatched work produced at a more comfortable, permitted distance. Njinga, ruling the kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba in the 17th century, engaged Portuguese colonial forces directly in a prolonged conflict that a European colonial power, accustomed to negotiating from a position of overwhelming, assumed superiority, had not expected to require decades of sustained military and diplomatic effort against a single regional ruler. She fought in an arena, direct confrontation with an expanding colonial empire, that smaller regional powers were generally expected to avoid rather than engage, and her sustained resistance forced a colonial power to negotiate on terms considerably more equal than its own assumptions had originally allowed for. Entering the arena is the first step. What settles the matter, once you're in it, is rarely the argument you make about your own competence. It is the work itself, produced at a standard doubt cannot survive contact with. The sixth law: answer doubt with work that cannot be argued with. Chien-Shiung Wu conducted the experimental physics work that disproved the assumed conservation of parity in weak nuclear interactions, providing the crucial experimental confirmation for a theory that earned two of her male colleagues the Nobel Prize, while her own contribution went unrecognized by that particular honor. A familiar pattern in the field she worked in, and one she answered not through public argument for credit, but through a body of subsequent experimental work so rigorous that her reputation among working physicists became essentially unimpeachable, regardless of which prizes acknowledged it. Mary Kies became the first woman granted a United States patent for a method of weaving straw with silk at a time when married women in much of the country faced legal barriers to owning property or holding patents independently at all. She pursued the patent regardless of the barriers, and the resulting legal document, undeniable, filed, a matter of record, settled a question that argument alone would have left permanently contested. The masses respond to doubt about their competence with explanation, hoping the right argument will finally convince a skeptic. The sixth law offers a more durable response: work rigorous and undeniable enough that its existence, rather than any argument made on its behalf, becomes the entire case. A skeptic can argue with a claim. It is far harder to argue with a filed patent or an experiment other physicists have already reproduced. The masses, doubted, often escalate the argument: louder claims, more forceful insistence on being taken seriously. The strategist recognizes that argument and evidence are not interchangeable currencies. An opponent unconvinced by argument is very often convinced, eventually, by evidence they cannot dispute, regardless of how they feel about the person who produced it. Mary Anning discovered fossils along the English coast throughout her working life that reshaped early understanding of prehistoric life, working largely outside the formal scientific societies that would not admit her as a member, and watched many of her discoveries published and credited to the wealthier male collectors who purchased them from her. The credit imbalance was real and was never fully corrected in her lifetime. What could not be disputed, regardless of who received the credit, was the accuracy and significance of the specimens themselves, a record that scientific history has, since, worked steadily to reattribute to her directly. Undeniable work settles doubt about competence. The seventh law goes further, asking whether the very circumstance that produced the doubt in the first place might actually be convertible into the credential that ends it. The seventh law: turn the assumed burden into the professional edge. Lillian Gilbreth, an engineer and psychologist raising 12 children while building a career in a field that offered women almost no formal path into it, eventually built a highly successful consulting career, applying time and motion efficiency principles to household management and industrial design alike. Turning the very domestic responsibility her era assumed would disqualify her from serious engineering work into the exact expertise that made her consulting uniquely credible, since she had tested every principle she taught directly on a household considerably larger and more complex than most of her clients managed. Mercy Otis Warren, denied any formal political role available to women of the American Revolutionary era, published anonymous political satire and historical writing that shaped public opinion during and after the Revolution, using the very assumption that a woman's political opinions carried no serious weight to publish work whose authorship remained undetected for years, allowing its arguments to be judged entirely on their content, rather than dismissed in advance based on who had written them. The masses treat an assumed limitation, a large family, a lack of formal political standing, any circumstance the culture around them has already decided disqualifies them, as a burden to be managed quietly and apologized for. The seventh law asks whether that same circumstance, reframed, might actually be the credential no competitor without it could ever claim. Consider an ordinary version: a career gap assumed to be a liability on a resume, reframed as direct experience in exactly the kind of adaptive problem-solving a role actually requires. A non-traditional background treated as a disqualifier by a hiring committee but recognized, correctly, as a source of perspective none of the traditional candidates can offer. The strategist audits her own supposed liabilities, the way Gilbreth audited her household, not to excuse them, but to locate the exact expertise hiding inside them. A reframed burden becomes a credential. That credential is worth the most in territory the credentialed competition hasn't bothered to contest in the first place. The eighth law: build where the competition hasn't bothered to look. Nellie Cashman built a series of successful business ventures across mining boomtowns of the American and Canadian frontier, choosing locations and enterprises that established, more conservative business interests had not yet considered worth the risk of investing in, and built a reputation and a fortune across decades of frontier commerce, precisely by operating in territory competitors considered too underdeveloped to be worth serious attention. Mary Fields became the first black woman to work as a star route mail carrier in the United States, a demanding and physically dangerous job on the Montana frontier that most established carriers avoided, building a fierce reputation for reliability across a route few competitors wanted in the first place, in a field where the low prestige of the position meant almost no one was competing with her for it at all. The masses look for opportunity in the same crowded, already validated arenas everyone else is also competing in, reasoning that a well-populated field must be well-populated for a good reason. The eighth law suggests the opposite question is frequently more useful. What territory has simply been overlooked, not because it lacks opportunity, but because it lacks the prestige that would attract serious competition to it first. This is, in essence, a question about where competition has been priced out by reputation rather than by actual difficulty. A field considered unglamorous frequently offers considerably more room to build an uncontested reputation than a prestigious one already crowded with serious rivals, precisely because prestige, not opportunity, is what determines where the competition chooses to gather. Mariam al-Ijliya al-Asturlabi worked as a skilled astrolabe maker in 10th century Aleppo, a highly technical craft requiring precise astronomical and mechanical knowledge in a field with little competitive crowding, specifically because the craft demanded a rare, unglamorous combination of skills few were willing to master. Her reputation, built in a niche largely left uncontested by more prestige-seeking competitors, earned her a position crafting instruments for the region's ruling court. Overlooked territory is where the eighth law finds its opportunity. The ninth law concerns what happens once you're actually standing in that overlooked post, producing results no one there expected to see. The ninth law. Let undeniable results speak from an overlooked post. Ida Lewis served for decades as the keeper of a lighthouse off Newport, Rhode Island, a position that attracted little public attention until her repeated, documented rescues of sailors and swimmers in danger near the lighthouse built her a reputation that eventually reached the highest levels of American public recognition, including a personal commendation. All built from a post most observers would have assumed offered no path to any significant reputation at all. Effa Manley co-owned and ran a Negro League baseball team, eventually becoming the first woman inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame, building her reputation not through any formal credential the baseball establishment would have recognized in advance, but through the simple, repeated fact of running a well-managed, competitive franchise in a business environment that offered women no obvious path to ownership at all. The masses assume a significant reputation requires a significant, visible starting position. The ninth law suggests that an overlooked post, treated with total seriousness and sustained excellence, frequently produces a more durable reputation than a prestigious starting position ever could, precisely because no one expected results of this quality to originate from a position this modest. The modern equivalent of this law is the unglamorous role, the overlooked department, the modest starting title. Treated not as a placeholder to escape as quickly as possible, but as a genuine platform for building an undeniable track record, precisely because a reputation built somewhere unglamorous carries a credibility. A more prestigious starting position, crowded with equally credentialed rivals, could never provide as cleanly. Beatrice Schilling worked as an aeronautical engineer solving a specific, unglamorous mechanical problem, fuel starvation in fighter engines during certain maneuvers, that more prestigious research priorities had left unresolved during the Second World War. Her practical fix, a simple restrictor device fitted directly to the engines and known informally among pilots by her own name, resolved a problem that had cost operational aircraft in combat, building her a reputation among working pilots and engineers considerably more durable than a more theoretical, prestigious assignment might have produced. 9 laws describe how to work within, around, or beneath a system that underestimates you. The final law asks the boldest question of all: what happens when you simply stop waiting for that system's permission altogether? The 10th law. Act first. Let the results request permission afterward. Grace Hopper, working in early computer science, at a time when the field offered women little institutional standing and considerable skepticism toward her ideas about programming languages that used words rather than pure numerical code, built early compiler technology largely by proceeding with the work before securing the full institutional approval that a more cautious approach might have waited for, an approach she is remembered for describing directly, that it is often easier to seek forgiveness than permission. The compiler work she pursued, despite skepticism, became foundational to how programming languages were built for decades afterward. Gladys Aylward was denied official missionary credentials by the organization she had hoped to serve with on account of her limited formal education, and traveled to China independently anyway, eventually leading more than 100 children on a dangerous overland journey to safety during the Japanese invasion. An act of leadership her original denial of credentials had never anticipated and could not have prevented, because she had simply proceeded without waiting for an approval that was never going to arrive. This is the 10th and final law, and the one every other law in this record has been building toward. Permission, in most of the contests this record describes, was never actually required to begin, only assumed to be. The masses wait for a credential, a title, an official blessing before proceeding with work they are already capable of doing. The strategist proceeds first and lets results the establishment cannot argue with request the permission retroactively, on terms considerably more favorable than waiting ever would have produced. This is not recklessness, and the distinction matters. Acting first only works as a strategy when the actor has genuinely done the preparation to back the action up, the way Hopper's compiler and Aylward's journey were both backed by real competence rather than mere audacity. The masses wait for permission because they are, correctly, unsure whether their work could withstand scrutiny without it. The strategist proceeds first because she has already made sure it can. Catherine the Great, a German-born princess with no blood claim to the Russian throne, orchestrated a coup against her own husband shortly after he assumed the crown, seizing power without any formal process, granting her the right to rule it all. She did not seek permission for the claim beforehand, from the court, the church, or any foreign power that might have objected. She secured the throne first, and then spent a reign of more than 3 decades, governing effectively enough that the question of her original right to it became, for most practical purposes, irrelevant to a court and a country that had long since stopped asking. 10 laws, 1 underlying asset. Every shortage in this record came bundled with an opponent who had stopped watching closely enough to see what was actually being built. Closing. The advantage that only disadvantage can provide. Every woman in this record faced a genuine structural disadvantage. Smaller forces, closed institutions, denied credentials, assumed irrelevance. None of them waited for the disadvantage to be corrected before acting. Each of them found, inside the very shortage she'd been handed, a specific and usable asset. An opponent who had stopped watching closely, a door that opened elsewhere, a post no one else wanted, a body of work too rigorous to argue with. The masses will always experience being the underdog as simple absence, less of everything the favorite already holds. You now have 10 laws worth of evidence that the position carries its own particular currency, spendable nowhere else, available only to whoever has been counted out. Let them count you out, then spend what that counting out affords you before they notice they've made a mistake.